July 18th, 1945, 2:23 a.m., the Sea of Okhotsk, off the coast of Karafudo, Japan. The darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just the black water of the Sea of Okhotsk stretching in every direction. And somewhere out there, hidden in that impenetrable night, a Japanese convoy carrying enough supplies to keep an entire army fighting for another month. Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye against the periscope, his heart pounding against his ribs. His hands were steady, though they had to be. 30 seconds from now, he would either sink an entire enemy convoy or send 87 American sailors to their graves at the bottom of the coldest sea in the Pacific. "Captain, we're inside the escort screen," whispered the radar operator. "3 destroyers. They haven't seen us." Fluckey didn't respond. He was counting ships. 1 tanker, 2 freighters, 3 more freighters, a transport vessel. And there in the center of the formation, the largest target he'd ever seen through a periscope, a 16,000-ton ammunition ship. If he hit that ammunition ship, the explosion would light up the night sky like the sun itself. It would also alert every Japanese destroyer within 50 miles to their position. "Torpedo room, stand by," Fluckey said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to sink them all." What happened over the next 47 minutes would become the most devastating submarine attack of World War II. And what no one knew, not even Fluckey himself at that moment, was that this single patrol would expose a fatal flaw in Soviet torpedo technology that would change the entire Cold War. But we'll get to that. Before you continue with this incredible story, if you're fascinated by the untold moments that shaped history, take a second to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. It helps us bring you more stories like this one, and if you're already subscribed, drop a like. It really makes a difference. Now, let's go back to understand how a quiet kid from Washington, D.C. became the most decorated submarine commander in American history. Eugene Bennett Fluckey was born on October 5th, 1913, in a modest row house in Washington, D.C. His father was a government clerk, his mother a schoolteacher. Nothing about his childhood suggested he would one day command one of the deadliest weapons ever created by mankind. As a boy, Eugene was unremarkable. Average height, average grades. He stuttered slightly when nervous, a trait that would follow him into adulthood. His teachers described him as quiet and thoughtful, the kind of student who disappeared into the back of the classroom. But there was one thing about Eugene Fluckey that set him apart, though no one recognized it at the time. He noticed things, patterns, details. The way a teacher always paused before asking a difficult question. The way his father's voice changed when he was lying about working late. The way certain clouds meant rain within the hour, while others meant nothing at all. This ability to observe, to analyze, to predict would one day make him the most dangerous man in the Pacific Ocean. At 16, Eugene saw a recruitment poster for the United States Naval Academy. The poster showed a gleaming battleship cutting through blue waters, and beneath it the words, "The Navy builds men." He applied on a whim. His test scores were good enough, barely, and in 1931 he walked through the gates of Annapolis as one of the most unlikely midshipmen in the history of the institution. What he didn't know was that 17 years later, those same analytical skills that had made him invisible as a boy would allow him to see something that no one else in the entire United States Navy could see. A pattern, a weakness, a flaw in Soviet torpedo design that would give America a decisive advantage in the Cold War. But first, he had to survive Annapolis, and that was no guarantee. The Naval Academy in the 1930s was a brutal institution. Hazing was not only tolerated, it was encouraged. Upperclassmen routinely beat plebes who showed any sign of weakness. The dropout rate exceeded 40%. Fluckey was hazed relentlessly. His stutter made him an easy target. Upperclassmen would force him to recite naval regulations in front of laughing crowds, watching him struggle to get the words out. Fluckey can't even talk, they mocked. How's he going to command a ship? But Fluckey never broke. He never cried. He never complained. He simply observed. He noticed which upperclassmen were all bark and no bite. He noticed which officers would intervene if pushed too far. He noticed, most importantly, the patterns of abuse, when they happened, where they happened, how to avoid being in the wrong place at the wrong time. By his second year, the hazing had stopped almost entirely, not because anyone liked him, but because he had become invisible again. He had learned to disappear. This ability to become invisible would later allow him to slip past Japanese destroyers in the night, but that was still years away. Fluckey graduated from Annapolis in 1935, ranked in the middle of his class. Nothing special, nothing remarkable, just another ensign in a Navy that was rapidly shrinking during the depths of the Great Depression. He was assigned to the battleship USS Nevada, where he spent 2 years learning the monotonous routines of peacetime naval service, inspections, drills, paperwork. The same thing, day after day, week after week. But Fluckey was still observing, still analyzing, and he noticed something that troubled him. The battleship admirals who ran the Navy were obsessed with surface warfare. Big guns, massive ships, fleet actions where battleships would line up and pound each other into oblivion. They spoke of submarines with contempt, calling them weapons of the weak, dishonorable vessels, underwater rats. Flucky disagreed. He had read about German U-boats in World War I, how a handful of submarines had nearly brought the British Empire to its knees. He had studied the mathematics of naval warfare and concluded that a single submarine, properly employed, could sink more enemy tonnage than an entire fleet of battleships. In 1938, he requested a transfer to submarine school. His commanding officer was horrified. "Submarines?" the captain said. "Flucky, you're throwing away your career. The future of the Navy is in surface warfare. Submarines are a dead end." "With respect, sir," Flucky replied, his stutter almost invisible now, "I believe submarines are the future, and I want to be part of it." The captain shook his head in disgust and signed the transfer papers. That decision, made in a cramped office aboard the USS Nevada, would change the course of World War II. Submarine school in New London, Connecticut was unlike anything Flucky had experienced. The men who volunteered for submarine duty were different, odder, more independent. They had to be. A submarine crew lived in impossibly cramped conditions, breathing recycled air, never seeing sunlight for weeks at a time. Only a certain type of person could handle that kind of isolation. Flucky thrived. For the first time in his naval career, he wasn't just surviving. He was excelling. His analytical mind proved perfectly suited to the complex calculations required for torpedo attacks. His ability to remain calm under pressure made him a natural in emergency drills. His quiet demeanor, once a liability, was now an asset in the confined spaces of a submarine. He graduated first in his class. But war was coming, and Flucky could see it as clearly as he could see everything else. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. In 1940, France fell. By 1941, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that America would be drawn into the conflict. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. 21 ships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,000 Americans were killed. The battleship admirals who had mocked submarines watched in horror as their precious surface fleet was crippled in a single morning. Suddenly, submarines weren't the weapons of the weak anymore. They were the only weapons America had left in the Pacific. Flucky was serving as executive officer aboard the USS Bonita when the war began. For the next 2 years, he participated in multiple war patrols, learning the brutal realities of submarine combat in the Pacific. The early war patrols were disasters. American torpedoes, it turned out, were catastrophically flawed. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of American submarines, had 3 separate defects that made it almost useless in combat. First, the magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath enemy ships and break their keels, rarely worked. Torpedoes would pass directly under targets and fail to explode. Second, the contact exploder, the backup system, was too fragile. When torpedoes hit enemy hulls at the proper angle, the impact would crush the firing pin before it could detonate the warhead. Third, the depth-keeping mechanism was miscalibrated. Torpedoes ran an average of 11 feet deeper than their settings, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. American submarine captains reported these problems repeatedly. The Bureau of Ordnance, the Navy Department responsible for torpedoes, refused to believe them. The torpedoes had worked perfectly in peacetime tests, they insisted. The problem must be the submariners themselves. Flucky watched captain after captain return from patrol with the same story. Perfect firing solutions. Torpedoes running straight and true. No explosions. He watched these men, brave men, skilled men, be blamed for failures that weren't their fault. And he observed. He analyzed. He began keeping his own records of torpedo performance, documenting every shot, every hit, every failure. He was building a case, though he didn't know it yet, that would eventually force the Navy to fix its torpedoes. But that was still in the future. First, he had to survive long enough to use that information. In April 1944, Flucky received the assignment that would change his life. He was given command of the USS Barb. The Barb was a Gato-class submarine, 312 feet long, displacing 2,400 tons submerged. She carried 24 torpedoes and was capable of 20 knots on the surface, 9 knots submerged. Her crew consisted of 87 men who would live, work, eat, and sleep in a space smaller than a typical American house. Flucky walked aboard and immediately began observing. He noticed that the crew was demoralized. The Barb had completed 8 war patrols under previous commanders with limited success. The men had stopped believing they could make a difference. He also noticed something else. The crew was afraid, not of the enemy necessarily, but of their own officers. Previous commanders had been harsh disciplinarians who punished every mistake severely. The crew had learned to hide problems rather than report them, to cover up errors rather than correct them. Flucky knew this kind of fear was deadly on a submarine. In combat, split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. A crew afraid to speak up would hesitate at exactly the wrong moment. On his first day as captain, Flucky gathered the entire crew in the forward torpedo room, 87 men packed into a space designed for 20, straining to hear their new commander speak. "Gentlemen," Flucky said, his voice quiet but firm, "I want to make something clear. On this boat, there will be no punishment for mistakes. If you screw up, I want to know about it immediately. Not because I want to blame you, but because I want to fix the problem before it kills us all." The crew exchanged skeptical glances. They had heard promises before. Furthermore," Flucky continued, "I believe every man on this boat has something valuable to contribute. I don't care if you're a cook or a torpedo man. If you see something wrong, if you have an idea that might help us, I want to hear it. The Japanese don't care about your rank, neither do I." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're going to sink ships, gentlemen. A lot of ships. And we're all going to come home alive. Every single one of us. That's my promise to you." It was an unusual speech, completely unlike the harsh discipline the crew had experienced before. Some of the men dismissed it as naive optimism. Others wondered if their new captain was soft, if he lacked the backbone to command a warship. They would soon discover how wrong they were. The Barb's 9th War Patrol, Flucky's first as commander, began on May 21st, 1944. The submarine was assigned to patrol the waters around the Kuril Islands, a chain of volcanic rocks stretching between Japan and the Soviet Union. These were dangerous waters. Japanese anti-submarine forces were everywhere. Aircraft patrols covered the daylight hours. Destroyer escorts prowled at night. The waters were shallow and filled with mines. Previous patrols in this area had achieved little. Flucky didn't care about what previous patrols had achieved. He cared about what he could observe. For the first week, he didn't attack at all. Instead, he watched. He noted the timing of Japanese air patrols. He charted the routes of destroyer escorts. He analyzed the behavior of convoy traffic, looking for patterns, looking for weaknesses. The crew grew restless. They had been promised action, and so far they had seen nothing but periscope watches and radar scans. "Captain," the executive officer said on the 8th day, "the men are getting anxious. They're wondering when we're going to engage the enemy." Flucky nodded. "Tell them we'll engage when I know we can win, not before." 2 days later, Flucky saw what he had been waiting for. A Japanese convoy, 6 ships escorted by 2 destroyers, following a route he had predicted 3 days earlier based on his observations. The destroyers were positioned exactly where he expected them to be. Their patrol patterns were exactly what he had calculated, and between them, invisible to their sonar, was a corridor just wide enough for a submarine to slip through. "Battle stations," Flucky said calmly. "We're going in." What followed was a masterclass in submarine tactics. Flucky navigated the Barb through the destroyer screen with surgical precision, using the noise of the convoy's own propellers to mask his approach. He closed to within 800 yards of the lead freighter, close enough to see the rivets on her hull through the periscope. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 torpedoes leapt from the forward tubes. 8 seconds later, the first freighter exploded. 12 seconds after that, the second freighter followed. The third torpedo missed, but Flucky was already swinging the Barb around to bring his stern tubes to bear. Fire 7, Fire 8. 2 more torpedoes. 2 more explosions. In less than 90 seconds, Flucky had sunk 4 ships without the destroyers even knowing he was there. But he wasn't finished. As the convoy scattered in panic, Flucky noticed something. One of the destroyers had broken off its patrol pattern, racing toward the wounded ships to pick up survivors. That destroyer's sonar operator was focused on listening for submarine propeller sounds. He wasn't expecting an attack from the opposite direction. "All ahead, full," Flucky ordered. "We're going after that destroyer." The executive officer's eyes went wide. "Sir, you want to attack a destroyer with torpedoes?" It was an insane idea. Destroyers were designed specifically to hunt and kill submarines. They were fast, maneuverable, and armed with depth charges that could crush a submarine's hull like a tin can. Attacking one head-on was suicide. "Trust me," Flucky said. "I've been watching him. He's going to turn to port in about 30 seconds. When he does, he'll present his beam to us for approximately 10 seconds. That's our window." The executive officer opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He had seen Flucky's predictions come true too many times in the past week. 28 seconds later, the destroyer turned to port, exactly as Flucky had predicted. Fire 9. The torpedo struck the destroyer amidships. The explosion broke her back, and she sank in less than 3 minutes. The crew of the Barb stared at their captain in disbelief. They had just done something that wasn't supposed to be possible. They had attacked a destroyer and won. Flucky smiled slightly. "Gentlemen, that's how we're going to fight this war. not by hiding from the enemy, but by understanding him better than he understands himself. The Ninth Patrol ended with 9 enemy ships sunk. It was one of the most successful submarine patrols of the war to that point. Flucky received the Navy Cross, the second highest naval honor. But he was just getting started. Over the next year, Flucky took the Barb on 4 more war patrols. Each one was more successful than the last. Each one demonstrated tactics that other submarine commanders considered impossible or insane. He developed a technique called running the coast, where the Barb would surface at night and race along the enemy shoreline, attacking targets that other submarines wouldn't dare approach. The shallow water that protected Japanese coastal shipping from torpedoes didn't protect them from Flucky. He simply got closer. He pioneered the use of rocket attacks against shore installations, turning his submarine into a mobile artillery platform. On one occasion, he sailed directly into a Japanese harbor, surfaced, and bombarded the town with rockets before disappearing into the night. He invented the concept of multiple overlapping attacks, where the Barb would strike one convoy, race ahead of its survivors, and strike again before they could reach safety. On several occasions, he sank ships that had already been torpedoed once, ensuring they would never be repaired and returned to service. His crew, the same demoralized men who had doubted him on his first day, became the most aggressive and confident submarine sailors in the Pacific. They volunteered for extra duties. They suggested new tactics. They competed with each other to find innovative solutions to problems. One torpedo man, a 20-year-old from Ohio named Billy Hatfield, suggested a modification to the torpedo warhead that increased its explosive yield by 15%. Flucky implemented the modification immediately. A cook named Joseph Markison noticed that Japanese patrol boats always changed course at the same point near a particular island. Flucky used that observation to set up an ambush that sank 3 patrol boats in a single night. The Barb became a laboratory for submarine innovation, and Flucky, the quiet boy who had once stuttered through oral exams, became known throughout the submarine force as the most aggressive captain in the Pacific. But his most remarkable patrol was still ahead. In June 1945, the war in the Pacific was reaching its final stages. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa. B-29 bombers were reducing Japanese cities to ashes. The invasion of the Japanese home islands was being planned for November. But Japan was not defeated yet. Millions of Japanese soldiers remained under arms. The Japanese merchant fleet, though badly damaged, continued to carry supplies to the home islands. Every ship that reached Japan extended the war by another day, another week, another month. The Navy's submarine commanders received new orders. They were to enter the Sea of Okhotsk, a body of water between Japan and Soviet Siberia that had been considered too dangerous for submarine operations. The waters were shallow, heavily mined, and patrolled constantly by Japanese anti-submarine forces. Previous patrols in the area had suffered heavy casualties. Flucky volunteered the Barb immediately. "Sir," his executive officer said, "the Sea of Okhotsk is a death trap. The other captains are calling it a suicide mission." Flucky shook his head. "The other captains are thinking about the risks. I'm thinking about the opportunities. The Japanese believe their shipping in the Sea of Okhotsk is safe. That means they've gotten careless. Careless enemies make mistakes. Mistakes we can exploit." On June 8, 1945, the Barb departed for her 12th war patrol. 87 men sailed into waters where no American submarine had ever operated successfully. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. The first week was reconnaissance. Flucky charted minefields, noted patrol patterns, and identified shipping lanes. He was building a mental map of the entire Sea of Okhotsk, looking for the patterns, the weaknesses, the opportunities that other commanders couldn't see. On June 22nd, he found what he was looking for. A Japanese convoy, 16 ships strong, was moving along the coast of Karafuto Island. It was the largest concentration of enemy shipping Flucky had ever seen. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, and in the center of the formation, the prize, a massive ammunition ship carrying enough explosives to supply the entire Japanese garrison on the island. The convoy was protected by 4 destroyers, 2 destroyer escorts, and continuous air patrols. Any other submarine commander would have considered an attack impossible. Flucky spent 3 days following the convoy, studying its defensive patterns. He noticed that the destroyers operated on a predictable schedule, changing positions every 45 minutes. He noticed that the air patrols followed the same routes at the same times each day. He noticed that the convoy commander, whoever he was, always positioned the ammunition ship in the center of the formation, believing that this protected it from attack. In fact, it made the ammunition ship more vulnerable. The destroyers protecting the outer ships couldn't respond quickly if an attack came from within the formation, and if the ammunition ship exploded, it would damage or destroy the ships around it. On the night of June 25th, Flucky made his move. The Barb slipped through the destroyer screen at 2 a.m., using the same techniques Flucky had perfected over the previous year. By 2:15, they were inside the convoy formation. By 2:30, they were within torpedo range of the ammunition ship. "This is it, gentlemen," Flucky said quietly. "When that ammunition ship goes up, every destroyer in this convoy is going to come straight for us. We're going to have approximately 4 minutes to inflict as much damage as possible before we have to run." He paused, looking at the faces of his crew in the red glow of the control room lights. "Make every torpedo count." The first torpedo struck the ammunition ship at 2:33 a.m. The explosion was unlike anything the crew of the Barb had ever witnessed. A column of fire rose 3,000 feet into the night sky. The shockwave rocked the submarine violently, even though they were half a mile away. Secondary explosions continued for nearly 5 minutes as the ship's cargo detonated. But Flucky wasn't watching the fireworks. He was already lining up his next shots. Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 3 more torpedoes, 3 more explosions. A tanker broke in half. A freighter capsized. A troop transport began listing badly, her hull torn open by the blast. Fire 5, Fire 6. 2 more ships hit. The convoy was in complete chaos now. Ships were scattering in every direction, some colliding with each other in the darkness, others sailing directly into the burning wreckage of their companions. "Captain, destroyers closing fast," the sonar operator reported. "Bearing 090, range 3,000 yards. Flucky had 1 torpedo left in the forward tubes. 1 shot. The destroyers would be on them in less than 2 minutes. He looked through the periscope. In the chaos of the burning convoy, he spotted 1 more target, a large freighter apparently undamaged trying to escape to the east. Fire 7. The torpedo ran straight and true. The freighter exploded, her cargo of aviation fuel sending another column of fire into the sky. All ahead, full, dive to 200 feet, right full rudder. The Barb dove beneath the waves just as the first depth charges began to fall. For the next 3 hours, the destroyers hunted them relentlessly. Depth charges exploded all around them, so close that the light bulbs shattered and the hull groaned under the pressure. But Flucky had planned for this too. He had studied the currents in the area, the temperature layers that would confuse enemy sonar. He had identified an underwater canyon where the Barb could hide, her hull pressed against the rocky bottom, her engines silent, her crew barely breathing. The destroyers passed directly overhead 3 times. Each time the crew of the Barb held their breath, waiting for the death that seemed inevitable. It never came. At dawn, the destroyers gave up the search. The Barb rose from her hiding place and surfaced to survey the damage. Behind them, the convoy was destroyed. 8 ships sunk, 4 more badly damaged. Over 5,000 tons of supplies, meant for the defense of the Japanese home islands, now resting on the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk. And the Barb hadn't lost a single man. But Flucky wasn't satisfied. He had promised to sink ships, and there were still ships to sink. Over the next 3 weeks, the Barb continued her rampage through the Sea of Okhotsk. They sank freighters, they sank tankers, they sank patrol boats and sampans and anything else flying the Japanese flag. By July 15th, they had exhausted their torpedo supply. 24 torpedoes fired, 23 hits. It was an accuracy rate that no other submarine in the Navy could match. Any other captain would have turned for home. The patrol had already been the most successful in submarine history. There was nothing left to prove. But Flucky had one more idea. An idea so audacious, so unprecedented, that even his own crew thought he had gone insane. "Gentlemen," he announced at a meeting in the crew's mess, "we're going to sink a train." The room went silent. "Sir," the executive officer said carefully, "submarines sink ships. We don't sink trains." "Why not?" Flucky asked. "We have rockets, we have demolition charges, and I've been observing the Japanese railway that runs along the coast of Karafuto. Every night at approximately 3:00 a.m., a train carrying supplies from the port of Otomari passes within half a mile of the shore. The tracks run along an embankment that's completely unguarded." He spread a hand-drawn map on the table. "We land a shore party here at this point. They set demolition charges on the tracks. When the train passes over the charges, we detonate them. The train derails and crashes into the sea. We become the only submarine crew in history to sink a train." The men stared at the map, then at their captain. "What if we get caught?" someone asked. "We won't," Flucky said. "I've been studying the Japanese patrol patterns for 2 weeks. There's a window between 1 and 4 now a.m. when this stretch of coast is completely unguarded. That's our window." The crew exchanged glances. It was a crazy plan, absolutely insane, but they had followed Eugene Flucky into the impossible before, and he had always brought them home alive. One by one, hands went up. Flucky smiled. "I need 8 volunteers." Every man in the room raised his hand. On the night of July 22nd, 1945, The Barb surfaced off the coast of Karafuto Island. 8 men climbed into a rubber raft and paddled toward the shore, carrying 55 pounds of explosives and enough ammunition to fight off a small army. The sabotage team was led by Lieutenant William Walker, a demolitions expert from Tennessee. His 7 companions included an electrician, a motor machinist, and 5 torpedo men who had volunteered for the chance to do something no submarine crew had ever done. They reached the shore at 1:47 a.m. The beach was deserted, just as Flucky had predicted. They crossed the sand quickly, staying low, and climbed the embankment to the railway tracks. The explosives were set in 15 minutes. Walker positioned the charges beneath a section of track that curved sharply, ensuring that any train traveling at speed would be unable to stop in time. A pressure switch was connected to the rails, designed to detonate the moment the train's wheels passed over it. By 2:30, the team was back on the beach waiting for the raft to take them home. At 3:07 a.m., they heard it, the distant whistle of a train. The men watched in tense silence as the locomotive appeared around the curve, its headlight cutting through the darkness. Behind it stretched 16 cars loaded with supplies and ammunition. The train hit the charges at exactly 3:12 a.m. The explosion threw the locomotive into the air. The following cars jackknifed, telescoping into each other with a sound like thunder. Several cars caught fire. One car, apparently carrying ammunition, exploded in a secondary blast that could be heard for miles. On the deck of the Barb, the crew watched in awe. They had done the impossible. They had sunk a train. The sabotage team was recovered without incident. By dawn, the Barb was racing south toward home, her crew celebrating the most extraordinary patrol in submarine history. When the official tallies were completed, the numbers were staggering. During her 12th war patrol, the Barb had sunk 17 ships, totaling over 80,000 tons. She had damaged countless others. She had bombarded shore installations with rockets and destroyed a Japanese train. And she had done all of this without losing a single crew member. Eugene Flucky was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. His crew received the Presidential Unit Citation. The Barb itself was credited with the most successful submarine patrol of World War II. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after the war would prove even more significant than what happened during it. In 1946, with the war over and the Cold War beginning, American intelligence officers began debriefing captured German naval personnel. Among them was a former U-boat commander who had spent time in the Soviet Union as part of a technical exchange program in 1940. This officer had observed Soviet torpedo testing and had made detailed notes about their performance. Those notes revealed something remarkable. Soviet torpedoes suffered from many of the same defects that had plagued American torpedoes early in the war. The magnetic exploders were unreliable, the depth-keeping mechanisms were miscalibrated, the contact exploders were too fragile. The Soviets had copied German torpedo technology, and they had copied its flaws along with its capabilities. This information was classified at the highest levels. American intelligence agencies spent years trying to confirm it through other sources. In 1953, they found their confirmation in an unlikely place: the detailed patrol reports of Commander Eugene Flucky. During the Barb's 12th war patrol, Flucky had engaged in several encounters with Soviet fishing vessels operating in the Sea of Okhotsk. The Soviet Union was officially neutral in the Pacific War, but their intelligence services were keenly interested in American submarine operations. Flucky, ever observant, had noticed something odd about these fishing vessels. Their radio antennas were too sophisticated for commercial use, their crew sizes were too large, and their movements seemed designed to observe the Barb's operations rather than catch fish. He documented everything, every sighting, every movement, every suspicious radio transmission. And in his debriefing after the patrol, he added a footnote that no one paid attention to at the time. Soviet vessels appeared to be particularly interested in our torpedo performance, possible intelligence gathering related to underwater weapons technology. That footnote led American intelligence to re-examine the entire question of Soviet torpedo capability. Combined with the German officer's notes, it confirmed that the Soviet Union was desperately trying to understand why American torpedoes worked when theirs did not. The answer, of course, was that American torpedoes hadn't worked either, at least not at first. But by 1945, after years of combat testing and countless dead submariners, the Bureau of Ordnance had finally fixed the problems. The Mark 14 torpedo that Flucky used in the Sea of Okhotsk was a completely different weapon from the Mark 14 torpedo that had failed so miserably in 1942. The Soviets didn't know this. They believed American torpedo superiority was inherent, built into the basic design. They didn't realize that the Americans had simply made all the mistakes first and learned from them. This misunderstanding shaped Soviet naval strategy for the next 4 decades. Unable to match American torpedo performance, the Soviets invested heavily in alternative technologies, faster submarines, quieter propulsion systems, longer-range missiles. They built a navy designed to compensate for weapons they believed they could never match. And at the center of this strategic miscalculation was a single patrol report, written by a quiet man from Washington, D.C., who had learned to observe things that other people missed. Eugene Fluckey retired from the Navy in 1972 as a rear admiral. He had served 37 years, commanded multiple submarines, and helped shape American naval doctrine for the nuclear age. But he never forgot the men who had served with him on the Barb. Every year, on the anniversary of the train attack, he would call each surviving crew member to reminisce about the night they had done the impossible. In 1992, he published his memoirs titled Thunder Below. The book became a bestseller, introducing a new generation to the exploits of the most successful submarine patrol in history. He died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 93. His obituary in the New York Times called him the most decorated naval officer of World War II. But perhaps the best summary of his legacy came from one of his crew members, a torpedo man named Paul Saunders, who served on the Barb's 12th Patrol. Captain Fluckey taught us that anything is possible if you're willing to think differently, Saunders said in an interview years later. He looked at the world and saw things nobody else could see, patterns, opportunities, weaknesses. And he used what he saw to do things that everybody said couldn't be done. We sank 17 ships in one patrol. We sank a train from a submarine. We came home with every man alive. And we did it because one man refused to accept that there were things submarines couldn't do. The USS Barb was decommissioned in 1954 and transferred to the Italian Navy, where she served for another 20 years under the name Enrico Tazzoli. She was finally scrapped in 1975, her hull cut apart at a shipyard in La Spezia. But her battle flag still exists. It hangs in the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, displaying the symbols of her wartime achievements. 17 Japanese flags for the ships she sank, plus one small image that appears nowhere else on any submarine battle flag in the world. A train. The lessons of the Barb's 12th Patrol remain relevant today. Eugene Fluckey demonstrated that technology alone doesn't win wars. What matters is how that technology is used and the human beings who use it. He showed that aggressive tactics, combined with careful observation and analysis, could overcome seemingly impossible odds. He proved that leadership means trusting your subordinates, encouraging their ideas, and creating an environment where innovation flourishes. And he revealed, perhaps inadvertently, that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is not a torpedo or a rocket or a bomb. It's the human capacity to observe, to analyze, to understand, and to exploit the weaknesses that others cannot see. The Soviet Union never did match American torpedo performance during the Cold War. Their submarines remained louder, their weapons less reliable, their tactics more predictable. And while there were many reasons for this, one of them was a fundamental misunderstanding that began in the Sea of Okhotsk in the summer of 1945. Eugene Fluckey couldn't have known that his patrol reports would influence Cold War strategy. He was simply doing what he had always done, observing, analyzing, documenting. The same skills that had helped him survive hazing at Annapolis. The same abilities that had allowed him to predict enemy movements in combat were applied one more time to a problem he didn't even know existed. That's the nature of true intelligence. It doesn't just solve the problems you know about, it solves problems you haven't even discovered yet. In the end, the story of the USS Barb is not just a story about submarines or torpedoes or even World War II. It's a story about human potential, about what becomes possible when someone refuses to accept the limits that others have set. By people who look at the impossible and ask, why not? By a submarine commander who decided that if his boat could sink ships, it could sink a train. By 87 men who followed him into the unknown and came home as legends. By the quiet observer who changed the world by simply paying attention. That was Eugene Fluckey. That was the USS Barb. And that is a story worth remembering. The crew of the Barb held their final reunion in 2002, nearly 60 years after their legendary patrol. Only 12 of the original 87 were still alive. They gathered at the Submarine Force Museum, standing before the battle flag they had helped create, remembering the nights when they had slipped past Japanese destroyers and the morning when they had watched a train tumble into the sea. People ask me what it was like, said William Walker, the lieutenant who had led the sabotage team ashore, and I tell them it was like being part of a miracle, not a religious miracle, a human miracle. The miracle of what ordinary people can accomplish when they're led by someone who believes in them. He paused, his eyes on the battle flag. Captain Fluckey believed in us. He believed we could do things that nobody thought were possible. And because he believed, we believed too. And because we believed, we did them. The flag still hangs in Groton today. 17 ships, one train, and the memory of 87 men who followed a quiet observer into the impossible and came home alive. That is the legacy of the USS Barb. That is the legend of Eugene Fluckey. And that is the true story of the spy who revealed Soviet torpedo weaknesses, though we never knew it, by simply being the best at what he had always been, a man who saw what others could not see. The Sea of Okhotsk is quiet now. The wrecks of the ships that Fluckey sank still rest on the bottom, their hulls slowly dissolving into rust and memory. The railway where the train once ran has been rebuilt and rebuilt again, carrying cargo for nations that were once enemies and are now trading partners. But somewhere in the archives of American naval intelligence, there is a footnote in a patrol report, an observation made by a quiet commander who noticed something odd about Soviet fishing vessels in the summer of 1945, a small piece of a puzzle that would take years to complete. And in that footnote, hidden among the technical details and tactical analyses, is the beginning of a secret that helped shape the Cold War, a secret that began with one man's ability to observe, to analyze, and to document what he saw. Eugene Fluckey never knew the full impact of his observations. He died believing that his greatest contribution to history was the 17 ships he sank and the train he derailed. He never learned that his patrol reports had influenced American intelligence estimates for decades, or that his documentation of Soviet interest in American torpedo technology had helped confirm suspicions about Soviet naval weaknesses. Perhaps that's fitting. Fluckey never sought glory. He never claimed credit he didn't deserve. He simply did his job the same way he had always done it, by observing, analyzing, and acting on what he learned. The world is full of people who talk about making a difference. Eugene Fluckey actually made one. And he did it not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through the quiet application of skills he had developed as a boy in Washington, D.C., watching patterns that nobody else could see. His story reminds us that history is not made only by generals and presidents. It is made by individuals who refuse to accept the limits that others have set, by people who look at the impossible and ask, why not? By a submarine commander who decided that if his boat could sink ships, it could sink a train. By 87 men who followed him into the unknown and came home as legends. By the quiet observer who changed the world by simply paying attention. That was Eugene Fluckey. That was the USS Barb. And that is a story worth remembering.